My name is Emily Tyler. I am stepping in for Chris Yelland, who is unfortunately unwell at the moment, so he asked me to assist by moderating today. I'm from Meridian Economics. We're an advisory firm that works at the intersection of climate, finance, and the energy sector, power in particular. We're based down in Cape Town, and I'm the climate lead, so my experience and focus is on, I'm an economist on climate and taxes and green finance and those sorts of things. So it's my pleasure to moderate today. Just a little bit about Mr. Roy Mato. He is a practicing attorney, founder and director of attorneys Mato Lafitte and Associates in Johannesburg, specializing in commercial and property law. Roy has extensive experience in assisting local and foreign corporate clients with company structuring and with commercial aspects of investing in South Africa, including MA and contractual law. Roy hosts seminars and workshops on topics related to his area of expertise and was the resident expert on Africa Business Radio's weekly The Property Show with Gavin Malope. He's been a contributor to the Real Estate Investor magazine, SAPCC publication, and other publications, including Transform SA. He is director of the SA Portuguese Chamber and the EU Chamber. Welcome, Roy.
Thank you, Emily. Can I maybe take you around with me wherever I go? Such a nice introduction. I wasn't expecting that. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Roy Mato, the chairman, president of the EU Chamber of Commerce. On behalf of the EU Chamber of Commerce, I wanted to welcome everyone, not only those in the room, but everyone else joining us online as well. The EU Chamber plays an important role in advocating for EU business in South Africa, and also encouraging trade between the EU and South Africa. Today's topic, and this event, of course, is important not only to demystify, but also clear up misconceptions around CBAM. And we are very privileged to have with us a stellar panel of speakers, including I want to make sure I pronounce it properly in Spanish way, Vicente Hurtado Roa, the head of the unit for CBAM from Brussels. Is that a good job? Wonderful. I think the privilege to have him here today from Brussels is because you get to hear from the proverbial horse's mouth, since he's head of the unit dealing with this. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who put this event together, including the EU delegation. I want to thank them for their support, and Flo Healy and Jaco Slabbert and their team for putting this together. Shout out to you, Jaco. Of course, the team from the EU Chamber, especially Pamina Bora, our Vice Chair, and our standing GM, Claudine van der Biel. So without further ado, I wanted to hand over to, again, our facilitator, Emily Tyler, then to introduce our speakers. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you very much, Roy. Just prior to doing that, a couple of housekeeping issues. First of all, to welcome you all here, and those in person at this event represent the industries that are most affected by CBAM. So it's really a pleasure to have you here today to voice some of the reality of what CBAM means and the challenges you're dealing with in terms of implementation. Want to welcome all the virtual guests online who are observing these proceedings, and we hope that this session will give you a good update on the CBAM and background to it. I'd like to welcome the EU dignitaries from Brussels and the EU delegation. You've come quite a way for this event and others. This event is organized jointly by the EU delegation and by the EU Chamber, so it's funded by the EU. Today's proceedings will run for 2 hours. It's divided into two. The first will be presentations by a number of speakers, and then the second part will be a Q&A session and a panel discussion. We're going to have a short break at 10. We're going to try and stick quite closely to time. So I'm going to hopefully don't have to be too strict on that, but we'll try and keep everyone moving through their paces. Just in terms of the online participants, the microphones will be muted throughout the event, and the There will be an opportunity for questions, which we will prioritize those who are who are in the room, not virtual. But there will be, the virtual participants can also raise questions. We'd ask you to do so by raising your hands and by typing in your question. Any questions that are not able to be asked today will be responded to via email. And a recording of this event will also be made available to you after this. I think that is it from my side. So I have then the pleasure of introducing for our opening address, Mr. Fulgencio Garrido-Ruiz. He joined the EU delegation to South Africa as the Deputy Head of Mission on the 1st of September 2023. Prior to his new appointment, he worked in the European Commission as Policy Assistant to the Director-General for International Partnerships. He served previously in the EU delegation to Albania between 2008 and 2011, and to Somalia between 2017 and 2019, the latter as head of the Political Press and Information section. So we'd like to welcome Mr. Ruiz. He's not here. Okay. I'm then going to move. Yeah, we've got more time for presentations, I guess, which is a good outcome of this. Unfortunately, he's not been able to join us. And so I'm going to ask, and I'm going to have to work on my pronunciation as well, but Mr. Vicente Hutaroa to come from he's the head of the unit for CBAM, DG TAXUD. Just a few words about Vicente. He's the head of the unit in the European Commission responsible for energy taxation and other indirect taxes. He first stepped into the Director-General for Taxation in 2006 when he was responsible for drafting the review of the Savings Directive before becoming the assistant to two previous Directors-General responsible for taxation. His experience in the European Commission also covers 7 years in the Secretary-General, working first on the European semester and then in the relations with the European Council. Prior to joining the European Commission, Vicente has been a tax consultant in Garrido, a law firm in Spain, for 10 years with an expertise in international taxation. It's a privilege to have you here and speaking to us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much and good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank, of course, the EU Chamber for organizing this event and also my colleagues in the delegation, of course. I think it's a great pleasure for us to be here, to be able to explain better to you CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, that, as you possibly know, has been in place since October 2023, but in a transitional period. So for the moment, it doesn't apply yet with financial obligations. So I think that's the good news, that we can work together, we can get ready to that. And that's our main objective during this transitional period, and also the objective of the mission here in South Africa this week. We didn't come alone. I mean, there are two colleagues, one colleague of mine and myself, who came to explain CBAM and to present CBAM, but we also organized a joint mission with colleagues from the Directorate-General for Clima in the European Commission, which is responsible of the emission trading system in the EU, which, as you know, has been our carbon price for many years, since 2005, and we are already in stage 4. And as you will see this morning, CBAM is mirroring how this EU ETS is working. And we also have a colleague from IMPA, International Partnerships. So the idea was to come to meet first, as we did yesterday, some of your public institutions. We met with 3 departments, the Department for Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, also with the National Treasury, which is responsible of the carbon tax in South Africa, in order to understand a bit better how the carbon tax works and also the plans for the future. And as you will see, this is also very relevant and important for us when it comes to the implementation of the CBAM. And finally, we also met with the Trade Department, the DTIC, where we had, I have to say, very nice conversations, very useful, and I think very constructive conversations to understand each other. So the objective of this morning is to dissipate first to explain what CBAM is, how it works, the objectives, the design, and also a bit the timeline, because sometimes it's a bit confusing how it's going to be applied. I mentioned the transitional period and the definitive period. But also, let's see if I can pass the slides from here. Yeah. Yes. Does it work? Yeah, it seems to work. By the way, if someone speaks Xhosa and you can check whether the translation is correct, let me know, because we made an effort to try to write in several languages, but I think we were not very successful. Good? Yeah, great. We will try to incorporate Zulu and other languages for the future. We will need your help. So as I was saying before, the objective today, this morning, is to explain better to you how the CBAM works and will work, and more importantly for you, what can be the impacts on South African industry in particular, and also how the South African industry can prepare, and also, for example, in terms of carbon pricing, how this can, of course, be considered under the CBAM. I think this is something important for you. You possibly know, and maybe many of you work for the steel, iron, steel, and aluminum sectors. These are the main sectors which will be impacted in South Africa with the introduction of the CBAM. And we will have, after this event, also specific meetings with the two associations in order to go a bit deeper into the details. So this morning, or in this event, I will try to be more general, but of course, in the session with the questions and the dialogue that will come after, I will be happy with taking more technical and in-depth questions. No, it's here. So first of all, why a CBAM? Why a CBAM, and why a CBAM now? I think that's important to understand. Even if, when I was presented as an expert in taxation, I think that if you need to understand something and you need to go away from this room with a good idea, is that CBAM is not a tax. It's not a tax, it's not a tariff. It has nothing to do with that. It's an environmental measure, which is going to mirror the carbon price that we apply in the European Union, also to the imported goods, in the same way, in a even-handed manner, as the goods which are produced in the EU. The idea is, and you will see how the design of the measure and how the CBAM will work. The idea, of course, is that we apply the same measures, the same carbon price, to the goods imported into the EU as if they would have been produced in the EU. Consider the VAT. I understand that you have a VAT or a VAT in South Africa. You apply the VAT to all consumptions, and you don't look at, or you don't make a differentiation whether the goods have been produced in South Africa or they have been imported from a third country. You apply the same rules, you apply the same rates on the goods. Of course, I suppose you have different rates depending on the goods. Normally, food can be exempted or taxed at a lower level. Here, we try to do the same, but with our carbon pricing. The question and the situation is that we have realized that as we are increasing our level of ambition with climate policy, and you possibly know that the European Union has already announced and even enshrined in legislation the objective of carbon neutrality by 2050, which means very ambitious targets for 2030, like, for example, at least a 55% reduction of emissions and even 90% reduction of emissions by 2040. We realized that, however, in an open economic like the European Union, where we really want to welcome goods from third countries because we need importations from third countries, however, we realized that when we were comparing the effective carbon price on the EU industry under the ETS with effective carbon price on the consumption of the goods on the EU territory, there was a big gap. I mean, I think there is a very good report by the OECD which explains this gap, and the gap is even bigger in those countries where there is a carbon price and the carbon price is higher. What I'm explaining may sound a bit strange to you since your carbon price is very low for the moment in South Africa, but as you will be increasing your carbon price, and we heard about the plans about increasing the carbon price, not only in nominal terms, but also in effective terms, that means that this situation will also arise in South Africa. It's not surprising that other countries, not only the European Union, but also, for example, the UK has announced a CBAM, or also Australia has launched a public consultation on a possible CBAM. The US has other plans. We know also about Canada. And we know also many other countries are considering or analyzing the impact of their carbon price and therefore the possibilities for a CBAM. This could be the case of South Africa, but also Brazil and other countries like Japan, South Korea are thinking about that. I will come back to that picture because that can be a bit scaring, the fact that there will be a proliferation of CBAMs, but I will come back to that point at the very end of the presentation. But the idea is that we realize that the efforts to decarbonize have to be global because the problem with the climate change is also a global problem. And the fact that the industry in one country could be in the European Union as it could be in South Africa will be completely watered down or offset or undermined by the fact that other industry in other countries are not decarbonizing their goods and other countries are not introducing carbon pricing. Let's be clear, with the CBAM, we don't force any country how they have to decarbonize. We don't tell any country whether they have to introduce carbon pricing or not. There are different ways of doing things. Even carbon price can be in different forms. I mentioned that we have a cap and trade system, which is the EU ETS, while South Africa has a carbon tax. But what is important to understand is that there is a big risk or there is a big problem if we continue decarbonizing in one part of the world. However, the rest of the world will not be doing their part. I mean, we were very reassured this week that South Africa is engaged with the fight against climate change and that there are also plans to reinforce the carbon pricing. I think that goes in the right direction. Of course, the message we got all the time, and we can discuss about that later on, is that you need time, your industry needs time to adapt, to introduce new technologies, and to decarbonize. We are completely aware of that. I mean, that's something that we fully understand. So we decided that a CBAM could be a good way to deal with what the literature says the risk of carbon leakage, which is, as I said before, the problem with this gap between the effective carbon price on the market or with the goods sold on the market and the carbon price, the effective carbon price at the moment of the production in the EU. In other words, also the risk that by introducing higher carbon pricing or more stringent rules, there might be an incentive to produce outside the European Union or to import more carbon-intensive goods. So what we try to do is to mirror our EU ETS. The big difference with our EU ETS is that the CBAM will not be a cap and trade system. The system, well, it will not be a cap and trade because first, we cannot limit the number of importations. That would be a WTO issue, and we don't want to do that. We are not introducing CBAM to protect the competitiveness of our industry or as a trade measure. It's purely an environmental measure. And at the same time, very importantly, it cannot be a trade system because we want to avoid speculation. We don't want to create or to set up an international market of CBAM certificates. So the certificates will be bought at the same price as the EU ETS price by the importers into the EU, and they will have to be used only for their own purposes. So to offset or to cover the emissions which are embedded in the production of the goods imported into the EU. So we try to design the measure in a way which looks like this ETS as much as possible, except for the two issues I mentioned. But for the rest, we will have the same price. It will be the same from 2026. The price of the CBAM certificates will be the same price that we apply to the EU ETS. There will be a weekly price. In the EU ETS, this price is set by an auctioning system. And then the importers will have to buy those certificates to cover their emissions. So the system will work very similarly. I'm not going to go more into the details because the obligations, and that's important to know, all the obligations fall on the importers into the EU. But of course, there is a role that you can play because you are the exporters of your goods. You know the carbon intensity of your goods, and you know whether you have paid a carbon price and what has been the carbon price. So this is the data that you will need to share with the importers in order to comply with the obligations under the CBAM. But we will come back to that later. I want to underline that the design has been made in trying to respect all our international engagements. Of course, WTO, compliance with WTO rules and the GATT rules, but also, very important, also with the Paris Agreement. We very often hear that we don't respect the principle of the common but differentiated responsibilities and RC, so respected capabilities, but that's not true. Because with the CBAM, we are not imposing any rules on what has to be done on the other side. I mentioned before, we are not imposing how you have to decarbonize, at what speed you have to decarbonize. And what we are doing just is comparing, of course, and making sure that the carbon price, the importation is the same. We respect, of course, our engagements in terms of free trade agreements or, for example, the customs union with Turkey. So we are really, we were very careful to make sure that by introducing CBAM, we are not introducing hurdles or barriers to trade. And I think that that's an important message. That would be the second message today. This is an environmental measure. This is not a trade measure. Of course, and we can discuss about that, any measure introduces an administrative burden. I mentioned you need to know your emissions, you need to know your carbon price, and of course, introduces some sort of procedures. What we are trying to do, and I will refer to that later on now, is also to simplify those procedures. We are working on that. There will be a proposal at the end of February on how to simplify CBAM, even before we apply CBAM. So, but that's something that we want to do, and that's why we also had this transitional period in order to learn. And it's also the purpose of this type of trips is to understand firsthand how you are impacted, and of course to listen to you. Very important, the CBAM does not apply to countries. So we don't differentiate between countries. You will tell me that 4 countries are exempted, or goods from 4 countries are exempted. Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, but there is a good reason, because they apply the EU carbon price. In the case of Switzerland, they have an ETS which is linked to the EU ETS, so they work very jointly, and the price is very similar. And in the case of the other 3 countries, they have the EU ETS. So it doesn't make sense to have a CBAM on those goods because they are already paying the same ETS that we are paying. But for the rest of the world, we will treat them all in the same way. And we will not target any specific country. We will target companies because we also know that different companies in one country have different carbon intensities. There are countries who produce different goods with different carbon intensities, who are doing an effort to decarbonize faster, who are introducing clean technologies. And the CBAM like this will be a big incentive for those companies and a big reward for those companies who are already decarbonizing. I think that's important to understand. If a company produces a steel with less emissions because, for example, they use electric furnaces, in that case, they will have a lower adjustment compared with another company who is producing, for example, primary steel with BOF, BF, BOF. Or it will not be the same whether you are producing with natural gas or you will be producing with hydrogen. I will come back to the more technical part on emissions, how to calculate the emissions, and the question about direct and indirect emissions, because I think that's very relevant. But this is the idea. The idea is that we will recognize, we will reward, and we will recognize the efforts, and we will reward those companies who are doing the green transition, who are introducing or who are investing in green technologies and therefore are reducing their emissions. In the same way I mentioned, we will also take into account the carbon price. If you already pay a carbon price on your emissions in South Africa, that carbon price, as long as it's an effective carbon price, it has not been rebated, reimbursed, or whatever, of course it's an effective carbon price, that carbon price can also be deducted. That means that the adjustment would be only the difference between the carbon price in the EU and the carbon price in South Africa. I know that you will tell me that the carbon price in the EU is very high. It's true. I mean, it's been increasing over time. I think that for many years we were below the 30 euros, which is something like 600 rands. Yeah, am I right? More or less. But now the price is nearly around 90 euros, 90. It has been increasing a lot over the last 2 years, and the expectation is that it will continue increasing. I will explain later on why. I mean, you can already anticipate that as we move to 2050, we need to decarbonize faster, and that, of course, will mean that the price will be going up. We can expect that then will go down possibly when the companies will be so decarbonized that they will not need to buy certificates or as many certificates as now. The CBAM, and that's the good news, is that will be introduced in a transitional period. First, because as I was saying before, from 2023 or from October 2023 until the end of this year, 2025, CBAM has been applying, but there were no financial obligations. So no need for importers to buy CBAM certificates, no payments, no cost from the CBAM. From 2026, this will change, but it will be gradually, as I will explain with the graph that you can see on your screen. What we are doing during this transitional period until the end of 2025 is just to collect data. We ask importers in the EU on a quarterly basis to report in a specific dedicated CBAM registry, where the customs, the national competent authorities for CBAM in the EU member states, the Commission, and also the importers have access. We ask them to supply information about how many tons they have imported of CBAM goods, and also we would like to know the carbon intensity of those goods, and also whether there has been some sort of carbon pricing. We are also collecting information about the methodology to assess the emissions, and that's important for us to understand, because we are also finalizing, fine-tuning the methodology to assess the emissions under the CBAM for the definitive period. And we also want to understand if there is a carbon pricing at the source. We wanted to understand how it works, what type of carbon pricing, how to calculate the effective carbon pricing, because these will help a lot in the definitive period. We came with this transitional period because we thought that everybody has to learn. Not only producers in the countries, not only importers, but also the Commission. And we are learning a lot about how, for example, steel is produced around the world, about the carbon intensities, about the different methodologies. I mean, we are learning a lot. And this is why we thought, let's take the possibility of having some sort of transitional period. We expected it to be longer. We expected to start in January 2023, but there were some delays because of discussions between the Council, so member states in the EU, but also the European Parliament. And this is why we came a bit later. But we still thought that 2 years and a quarter, that's 2 years and a quarter, was good, sufficient time in order to learn about the system. The idea is that exporters take the opportunity during that time to understand CBAM, to calculate the emissions, and to be able to share that information with importers. And also for the importers in the EU, sometimes I receive complaints from big producers of steel in South Korea or in Japan. They say, listen, my clients in Europe, they don't know CBAM. We say, okay, that's bad. Something is done wrongly. I mean, we should do more outreach. That's clear. I think that now, as the time goes by, everybody is understanding CBAM, everybody is getting used to it, and we are also learning from the experience. And this is why, as I will explain later on, we want to come also with some simplifications in order to make sure that we streamline the process. Your feedback will be also important. I mean, we are listening to all of you. As I will mention later on, there is a new module from 2023 in the registry, which is open to operators in third countries, where they can register and also access the CBAM registry in order to share data with us directly. So, I mean, we are learning from that. From 26 to 2034, the system will also be introduced gradually. Why? And that's important to understand, because we very often hear that CBAM puts pressure or a burden on producers in third countries, but I think that we forget very often what happens in the EU. The thing is that, as you possibly know, you have also the same with the carbon tax in South Africa, where you have some sort of allowances, I think you call them allowances, something similar. In the EU, we also have what we call free allowances. That means that according to some benchmarks per goods, if you are a good producer, for example, you are, and the benchmark normally is set at the average of the 10% of the best producers for that good in the EU, you get all your emissions free, or you get a discount. In other words, you get free certificates, free ETS allowances, and therefore there is no cost. I can say that, for example, in the steel sector, about 80%, so far 80% of the emissions were covered by these free allowances. But however, as we are approaching 2030, 2040, and in particular 2050, these free allowances have to go because we need to accelerate the decarbonization, and also because our cap, I mentioned that the ETS is a cap and trade system, our cap is declining over the time, and therefore also the benchmarks are being reduced, and also the free allowances are being reduced. But the agreement was that for those sectors which are in the CBAM, the phase out of the free allowances would be faster. So far, the free allowances have helped to deal with this risk of carbon leakage. Now we are introducing CBAM. In the medium long term, we don't want to have two measures. We will get rid of the free allowances and we will have a CBAM. I can tell you that the EU industry is very annoyed, unpleasant, no, not unpleasant, sorry, uncomfortable. They're not unpleasant. They are uncomfortable with the idea that we love our industry. This is where we are meeting with industry. They are uncomfortable with the idea that the free allowances will have to go, and so fast, and in particular for the CBAM sectors. For example, if you think about that, by getting rid of the free allowances, they will be more and more exposed to competition from other countries, in particular in other markets, in third markets. Let's take the example of Kazakhstan. I mean, if I'm producing steel in the EU, exporting to Kazakhstan, and I have to compete with steel from, I think I can name countries, China or India, where there is no carbon price, or the carbon price is very low, where they are intensive in carbon, but there is no cost for those emissions, I mean, it's clear that there is an issue. There is an issue of competition. So just to say that by introducing CBAM, we are not only putting pressure on third countries to decarbonize, but we are also putting a lot of pressure on the EU industry to decarbonize because of this phase out of the free allowances. And here on the graph, you have the trajectory for the phase out. So at the beginning, in 26, 27, there will be a slight reduction of those free allowances. So you need to understand what is the benchmark, and we will be publishing the benchmarks by the end of this year, by the way, so that you know, okay, this is the benchmark. If I'm below the benchmark, I will not pay CBAM, or there will not be any adjustment. But of course, this benchmark for CBAM, let's try to call it like that, will be reduced over time from 26 to 2034. As you can see, in the first years, I would say up to 2030 or 2029, the reduction will be very slow. That also means that the impact of the CBAM will be low. Okay. Only if you have a carbon intensity which is exceeding this benchmark, you will have, or the importer will have to pay CBAM for those emissions that exceed the benchmark. From 2030, there is already a 48.5% reduction, which is quite considerable. I think, and according to our calculations, it will be by 2030 when you start to feel really the impact of the CBAM, and it will be, of course, by 2034 when it will be 100% phase out of all the free allowances. Yeah, that we will really feel the effect. These are the sectors. We apply to iron, steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizers, hydrogen, and electricity. These are the sectors which were chosen because, first, they are very intensive in carbon emissions, and secondly, because they are also very much or highly traded within the EU. In the case of South Africa, of course, you are mainly concerned with the first two. There are less importations of cement, and I don't think that for the moment you are exporting the other three. I don't think electricity will be exported from South Africa to the EU. It's quite far away. But hydrogen, for example, can be. So if you have plans, and I understand you have plans for green hydrogen, that could be something that with the CBAM can be accelerated or can be rewarded in the case of exportations of green electricity. Now we have sort of the de minimis rule. If you are importing less than 150 euros in a consignment, this does not have to comply with the CBAM, but as I will say later on, this is a very low threshold. We thought that we need to come with something higher. So this graph, but I think I can skip it quickly, is just to show how the adjustment will work. If you understand what I explained before, it will be quite intuitive. First, from 23 to 25, no adjustment. From 26 to 2033, when there will be this gradual phase out, you will only pay, or the imported goods, I mean, the importers will only have to pay based on the excess of the emissions. And then from 2034, all the emissions will have to be subject to the CBAM. If you are wondering in terms of countries impacted by the CBAM, as you can see here, not surprisingly, mostly our neighboring countries, which are our main trade partners, but also the main producers of steel and aluminum, because these are, well, steel, iron, steel, and cement are the most traded CBAM goods. I mean, you can see that those countries are, as expected, the ones which are mostly impacted. You can see that South Africa comes at the bottom, but this is only one side of the coin. If you look at the other side of the coin, you will realize, of course, that the impact on South Africa is much more important than you could see from the previous graph, because we understand that around 4% of your exports, global exports, are still iron steel, and I think around 1% is aluminum. And then the EU is one of the main destinations, in particular for aluminum, where I think you are exporting 35% of the total exports of aluminum. In the case of iron steel, I think it's much lower. Then we also realized that there is a big concentration also of your exports around the three products that you can see here: ferrochromium, non-alloy pig iron, and unwrought aluminum, okay, which are also products that normally are primary products and which are normally intensive in carbon emissions. That means that in one way or another, of course, the introduction of CBAM may have some sort of impact on your exports. As I said before, we are collecting data. I think that that's less relevant. The problem is that for the moment, the meaningful data based on actual emissions and carbon price is only arriving at the end of this year. So for the moment, at the end of last year, was starting to arrive at the end of last year. So I think that now it's difficult to say that we have data that we can share with you, but we are working on a report. I will mention it also later on, that will come at the end of the year, where we'll be able to give some data about implementation of the CBAM. I mentioned this new portal. If you are interested, this is something that, I mean, we can discuss also later on. This is a new portal in the registry where you can ask to have access directly and where you can share part of the data with us. For example, I can tell you that many South Korean, Japanese, but also Turkish steel companies were complaining that they didn't want to share with us, for example, the proportion of the scrap that they use for the production of their steel or aluminum. But that's important and relevant in order to calculate the emissions. For the moment, we don't assign any emissions to the scrap. We can discuss that later on, but it's important in order to calculate the emissions. So this is why there is this new opportunity where this data can be shared with us. We will not share with the EU industry, just be reassured, but the idea is that we are able also to assess the calculation of the emissions. By the way, I didn't mention that before, but I would like to underline that during the transitional period, there is no obligation of verifying the emissions, but there will be obligation of verifying the emissions by a third party, independent third party, from 2026, when the system will apply. And I have to rush because I know that I'm losing my time. Just very quickly to mention that in 25, we are working on developing legislation. I mean, there is a CBAM regulation, of course, but we have to develop some of the more specific and technical issues, like, for example, who can verify the emissions, how the verification should be done, but also, for example, about the carbon pricing. That can be more interesting for you. We will be working also on the review report, which is due by the end of the year. And this report will analyze, among other things, the possibility, and that's important for you to know, the possibility of extending also the scope of the CBAM to other sectors, for example, chemicals, polymers, I mean, other intensive, carbon-intensive sectors. Let's be clear, we will never think about extending to sectors which are not in the EU ETS. So, for example, agricultural products. I mean, we get those questions very often. That's not the idea, of course. And only to those sectors which are really at risk of carbon leakage. We will also consider whether we extend also the scope of emissions. For the moment, we only apply scope 1 emissions. So the emissions which are directly produced at the level of the installation in the case of cement and fertilizers. But we are analyzing possibly the extension also to the other sectors, iron, steel, and aluminum, where, of course, these emissions are very, very important. And finally, and this is what I was saying before about simplifications, we are working on simplifications. There will be a proposal, possibly, if nothing changes, adopted by the end of this, a proposal by the Commission at the end of this month. Then, of course, we need to move to discussions with Council and Parliament. It should be adopted before the end of the year, where what we want to do, basically, and I think that's the important message, is that we really want to simplify the system. In terms of processes, I will not go into the details, maybe afterwards during the discussion, but more importantly, we have realized during this transitional period that around 80% of the importers import less than 2% of the CO2 emissions, and also in terms of mass. So we are asking many importers, many companies to do the CBAM reporting while the data or the impact is really meaningless. So the idea is, as our commissioner says, let's cut the tail of the elephant. CBAM is the elephant in the room. Let's cut the tail. Well, the tail is very small in proportion to the animal. Okay, let's cut the tail of the snake. It's not a snake. I don't like the, okay, the metaphor. Let's cut the tail. Let's get rid of the obligations on those who are small importers. We need to analyze what will be the impact in terms of your exporters, but that's something that we want to do with your departments in South Africa to really analyze the impact of this simplification. But let's get rid of that, and then we will be able to concentrate where the thrust is. And I think that with that, I don't have much time, no? Okay, perfect. I stop here. I know that there will be many questions, many issues which are completely unclear, but I will be happy with taking some of the questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vicente, and apologies for rushing you. It was a very interesting presentation, and I think we, as a South African, we really appreciate the spirit of learning that you're bringing and openness to understanding our experience, and also the simplification will be very welcomed, I'm sure. I'm now going to invite, we're going to take questions after the tea break, so I'm going to now invite Mr. Hendrik de Villiers, Head of Environmental Sustainability at Hulamin, to come and give us the perspective of one of the industries that's going to be most impacted by the CBAM and who has been responding over the transitional period and grappling with some of the issues of implementation. Hendrik currently heads up the sustainability initiatives, which include the resource efficiency team, focusing on gas, electricity and water efficiency improvement and sustainability initiatives. Hulamin operates the only aluminium rolling mill in South Africa, located in Pietermaritzburg, KZN, and produces aluminium beverage can stock, aluminium plate, foil, as well as heat exchanger materials for the automotive industry as some of its largest product ranges. Approximately 60% of this is for the export market. Hendrik leads the Hulamin initiatives aimed at navigating the challenges of the changing energy market and worldwide shifts taking place in terms of customer environmental demands, legislation and taxation, particularly aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions in an effort to reduce global warming. Thanks, Hendrik.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity, and good morning to all of you, and also online. So let me get into my presentation straight away. The display seems clear. Good. So first of all, I just want to also recognize my colleague Sane Mlaloze, who's actually our sustainability manager. And she's actually the most versed person in Hulaman on this topic. So this is both recognition as well as a disclaimer. So if any questions come afterwards that I can't answer, I'll defer to her. I'll give you a quick introduction of Hulaman, just for those that don't know the aluminium industry. What you see on the screen is just our two sites in Pietermaritzburg. They are next to each other, connected and integrated in their operations. But we also have a facility in Richards Bay where we get liquid metal. The top right-hand slide shows that, or picture shows that. We are right next to the South 32 smelter, and we get liquid metal from them. And we cast that into ingots, and then we process it downstream in the facilities in Pietermaritzburg. It has already been mentioned that we are in the automotive sector, and a large portion is the packaging of beverage cans. The two alloys that are involved in making the can bodies and the can end is kind of big players in what we do. So I'll skip over that slide. And then this is quite a busy slide based on 2023 published financial data. The most important figure on this slide to note is the Europe figure there. That for that financial year, 22% of our revenue was gained from exports into the EU. And then I'm going to take you through a few slides, just quickly giving you a feel for the type of industry we're in, the complexity that there is in our facilities. So we start by putting metal of different forms into our melting furnaces. And I have to stand still on this topic a little bit because this is where a big portion of what eventually gets to our customers gets determined already. So at the bottom of the slide, you will see that the input materials that go into our melting furnaces, these are gas smelters. Virgin aluminium, that refers to the iron ore that's been refined and smelted at the smelter, and we then get aluminium. That is virgin aluminium, very electricity intensive, and that would explain that in South Africa with our grid, that has a very high carbon footprint coming into us. And there's nothing we can do about it, so we are dependent on our supply chain for making any changes there. Then in the second place, we've got all the alloying elements, manganese, chrome, magnesium, etc. That also goes in there. You report them individually, unless they're more than 5%, then you take the metal as the carbon footprint. And then we get our internal rework scrap. We trim off the edges, lead and tail ends, etc. If we scrap coils, that goes back in. And then lastly, the scrap is in green because, as already mentioned, scrap that comes back into the business comes in with a zero carbon footprint. So it's obvious then that the more we recycle, the better our carbon footprint our customers are going to be. So starting with red, very carbon intensive, going down to green, zero carbon footprint. The rest of the picture then just explains that in the furnace we alloy and we stir and we do everything needed to get the metallurgical properties right, and we cast it into an ingot. That ingot weighs something in the region of 15 tons. And what we then do is on the top right-hand corner, we put that ingot into a furnace, we heat it up so that it's soft. We roll it down in our hot mills on the top left-hand corner. And at the bottom, when it's at the right gauge, we then coil it up into a coil format. The next stage then is that coil gets cooled down, and then it gets rolled to the final thickness that our customer wants through a series of rolling mills. And from there, it goes to a combination of slitting lines, coating lines, etc. We might just trim off the edges and pack the whole coil, or we might slit it in very narrow slits, like on the picture shown. And then we pack it, and that's how our product gets to our customers. So now I get to the real content of what I'm going to share with you, which is how did Hulaman so far determine to cope with the requirements of reporting, etc. So there's two slides on measuring carbon emissions. So I have to apologize. I have very good eyesight, but this screen is blurred, so I found that if I use my glasses, it improves it. Apologies for the glasses. So, first of all is measuring your emissions. Hulamin uses indirect measurements, and that means that we don't put any instrumentation in our stacks to measure what goes out the stacks. It's very difficult, expensive, unsustainable. But it's very easy to measure the electricity kilowatt hours that we use and the gigajoules of gas that we buy. And that's called an indirect measurement, and that's one of the methodologies that is acceptable for CBAM reporting. So that is what Hulamin uses. So first of all, the scope 1 emissions, the direct emissions that happens on our site with the combustion of LPG and natural gas. So we measure that at each stage of the process, and there is then emission factors associated with the natural gas or the LPG that we use. There is a kilogram of CO2 equivalent per gigajoule of gas that we use. So that's the indirect measurement for scope 1. For scope 2, which is the indirect emissions, which is electricity basically, we measure the amount of electricity that we consume. And there is an emission factor associated with every kilowatt hour. And Eskom does publish in South Africa these different emission factors, but the IEA values are what the CBAM prescribes to be used for South Africa. And then, now that you've measured your scope 1 and 2 inputs, you have to track your metal, because you actually need to know where the energy was used. So that we've got a range of products, I'll cover that later on, but you actually then need to have metal tracking through that, all of those processes, so that when you've had a furnace melting 70 tons of metal, which ingots were produced in doing that? How much scrap metal went into that charge? You've got to track everything, otherwise you don't know what comes out at the end. And that is quite a process in our case. There's more than 50 processes that ingot can go through and eventually become a coil. We have way more than 1,500 coils or ingots in processes at any given stage in our plant. So it implies a vast infrastructure of power, gas, and other meters connected to our processing machines and the metal tracking systems that follow that metal around. And then there's the issue of the embedded emissions, which would be scope 3. It's all other emissions that are embedded in your input metals. So like that I explained in the melting furnace, what comes in our virgin metal is embedded, and you have to report on that. And this is a major impact for Hulamin. And it implies that our supply chain also has to be able to report. So if you're in an industry where you buy in anything that's got embedded carbon in it, your suppliers need to be able to measure and report that accurately to you. And then finally, that when we report into the EU, there are combined nomenclature codes for reporting. And in our case, with our product mix, our products fall into 10 different categories. So can body stock might be one, can end stock might be another, heat-treated plate might be another, etc., etc. So the energy consumption and the source of the metal inputs for each ingot produced and each coil processed has to be measured individually during each of those process steps to actually determine and accurately determine the carbon footprint per category. And we pass that information on to our customers, and they currently declare it when they import those tons. Okay. The next page. This comes out of the public domain information. What is important here is to note that on the top left, there is the primary aluminium production, which ends up inside that top left blue area with the aluminium. That is the product that Hulamin buys. On the top right hand, you've got your secondary aluminium recycling, cleaning, and so on. And then at the bottom, the cast house. That is basically where Hulamin starts, and we produce foil extrusions, and we've got rolling mills. The red border is what's important here. The CBAM rules currently state that that is what we need to report to the EU. So that means that the aluminium coming in from the smelter is inside the red border. It's regarded as embedded into the product. And therefore we need the smelter to supply us with information, and we pass that on. So basically everything that comes into that red border is what gets measured, reported, and CBAM levies applied to. Okay, now practically on the reporting side, we've been doing this since Q4 of 2023, and we will continue with it until Q4 of this year, before any payment becomes applicable then from January next year. Reporting is done on Scope 1 and 2, even though Scope 2 is not included in the CBAM levies for aluminium at this stage. It needs to be reported. It's a requirement, and everything that is embedded, I've explained the terminology around embedded. And we also have to report how much carbon tax that we pay locally, because of course that will get deducted. We will cover that later. So the last bullet under the reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, the implications for us is that what we buy and who we buy it from, whether we buy virgin metal or scrap or semi-processed, all of those decisions will be influenced by the embedded greenhouse gas emissions of that product, because it drives the impact that CBAM will have on us. Okay. Verification of these reporting, emissions reporting, as mentioned, it's not required currently. It will only be a requirement from next year on. But the guidelines for verification are already available. And in the case of Hulamin, we are undertaking a verification process this year. We are going to do that because we want to minimize the risk to our business of having gotten something wrong somewhere, and be ready for when it kicks in. The third bullet, there are CBAM penalties for incorrectly reporting embedded emissions, and there's a range of prices from 10 to 50 euros per ton that will be applied, so it's not insignificant. The verification standards and the third-party verification competence and so on still has to be determined and implemented, established in South Africa. It is in process. SANAS are busy with a company or two, I believe. And then this obviously implies further compliance costs in terms of being able to get verification done on your site, etc. Last topic, payment of the CBAM levies. The exact pricing of the levies is not known yet, estimated to be between 80 to 100 euro by 26. We heard earlier that currently it's sitting at about 90 euro. The levies on Scope 1 emissions embedded is effective from 1 January 26. That is known for our industry. A decision has not been announced yet on Scope 2 levies, and I think it ties up with the timeline we heard earlier that it is expected to be announced before the end of this year. Okay, so the proposed implementation of CBAM. I am doing this, the next 3 slides is a calculation to show you the financial impact, if you are wondering what's the impact going to be. So on this slide, you can see that this is data to be used if supplier-specific data is not known. Our data is known, but for the purpose of a public presentation, I'm using this. This is public domain information once again. Important to note on the left-hand side, the blue dots represent Scope 1 or direct emissions from different countries. So Mozambique on the left, and you can see the blue dots following right through to South Africa on the right-hand side. In terms of Scope 1, there's not much difference between the countries. South Africa is more or less aligned. The orange dots, however, is the big problem. Indirect emissions, Scope 2, electricity. And you can see that they range from very low on the left-hand side to extremely high on the right-hand side, and that's South African Eskom dilemma that we all know about. It results in a total emissions, according to these prescribed measures, if you don't have your own data available, of a measure of around about 18 tons of CO2 embedded for every ton of aluminium in this country. So remember that figure, it's going to come up on the next slide, and remember where that figure sits in relation to the rest of the world. Your slide is updated, mine is here. Okay, so we start with that figure of 18. SA products exported to the EU are, for the purposes of this presentation, assumed to be that 18 tons of CO2 per ton of aluminium. Second bullet, we assume a price of 80 euros per ton of CO2. Third bullet, we take the graphs of implementation, and we say that by 2034, it is 100% implemented. This graph is exactly the same as the one shown before. It looks slightly different, but the blue line just shows the phase in of CBAM, and the red line shows the phase out of the free allowances. So over the next 8 years, it's going to be implemented until you reach 100% by 2034. So the scenario I'm sketching for you now is the 2034 scenario with certain assumptions. And we'll see the calculation on the next page. So using the assumptions and the publicly available data, they have been translated into a percentage of the aluminium price, and I'm using 2,500 euros per ton as the LME for aluminium. And then by 2034, it says, this comes out to the bottom line, is levies on aluminium products of SA origin would reach more than 50% of the value of unprocessed aluminium. And that is the shocker. This is for a given CBAM price. It's the worst case scenario where Hulamin has not taken any mitigation actions to compensate for this. So take that as it is. But the idea is just to give you a percentage of LME price that this could amount to potentially. So what are we doing about this? So the first step is always resource efficiency. No matter what you do, you first try to reduce your consumption. That saves you a lot of money in its own. And then eventually, if you have CBAM levies, of course, it will save you there as well. Resource efficiency projects, in our experience, has a payback of 3 years or less. So that's what you're looking for there. It's good money invested there. Second bullet is why I focused on this during one of my first slides, is your scrap inputs, because the embedded emissions, you've got to fix that right at the start. Increase the use of scrap to displace primary aluminium to the maximum extent possible, since primary has a very high embedded emissions. We are busy with that. We're trying our best to buy more scrap. We are investing in recycling facilities to clean up and be able to recycle more metal. And of course, it fits in with the whole recycling drive on its own in any case. The little block on the right-hand side is just a reminder of why the scrap inputs into what goes into your furnace is so important. The third heading there, the low carbon energy, scope 2. Now, this is where I said that this is where South Africa is way out of line with the rest of the world. So we have to integrate renewable and other low emission electricity sources into the whole supply chain in South Africa. It can't be a Hulamin thing. It needs to be all of the supply chain. And I don't see a way that this can be done independent from the national grid. It can't be done at company level alone. We can have initiatives at company level, but the size of the facilities demand a national grid kind of effort. And then the South African carbon tax. This was mentioned before as well. Since CBAM is only levied on the difference between what you pay domestically in your country of origin and the CBAM levy of the EU, the aim should be to keep the taxes local. So the SA government should design mechanisms to levy these taxes in South Africa and then use that to decarbonize the South African industry, especially energy intensive users like ourselves, etc., that play a large role in our country's well-being and are now at risk due to our grid emission factor. And then my last point there, market protection. This has also been mentioned. The EU is protecting its industry by introducing CBAM. Many other countries are considering it or working on it. The SA government should implement a similar South African CBAM on aluminium imports. That's what we're interested in, into South Africa, in order to protect the domestic market against imports that are not taxed on their carbon emissions in their country of origin. Okay, and then lastly, I've just listed a couple of things that is still not 100% sure for us, or perhaps very unclear for us. The timing, if and when, of inclusion of scope 2 emissions, since that is our biggest concern in South Africa, that is a big unknown to us. The use of energy attribute certificates, I get questions on this a lot, and there's a lot of uncertainty about this. Currently, energy attribute certificates are not allowed unless they are bundled up with a power purchase agreement. So we can't go and buy them unless we've got a power purchase agreement that binds them together. How will that change over time? What happens when you deal with a trader? All of those are issues that we are not 100% clear on. There's talk of these sector benchmarks under the ETS. How and if they will influence CBAM is an unknown to us, but it can have a significant impact. How to forecast the ETS pricing if we want to sketch scenarios for our scenario planning. It's not clear, it seems complicated to us at least, to be able to forecast that accurately. And then there's a practical issue of the timing of the CBAM levies. So CBAM certificates must be purchased upon importation of the customer that imports the metal, but it does provide for the deduction of taxes already paid in the country of origin. The thing that we don't understand yet is that the South African carbon taxes will only be finalized and paid by the middle of the following year. So how will this be reconciled with the payment of CBAM in the EU? We don't know that. And I'm sure that there will be many other issues coming up as we approach the payment date. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hendrik. I think that gives a really detailed and specific sense of what you're facing and the issues you're having to work through as a result of the CBAM. And what stands out for me is the uncertainties in relation to the carbon tax and how that will play through, and then also the real challenges we have in the power sector in terms of its transition and what is possible and isn't possible and what needs to be done to unlock the ability of Hulamin to access green power. And now I'm aware we are running quite a way behind time, but I think it is both presentations, and I'm sure Rosalind's as well, are going to be have been really clarifying and helpful for setting the scene. So I'm now going to invite our last presenter, Mrs. Rosalind dos Santos. She's the Group Energy Manager of Impact, one of the leading paper and plastics packaging manufacturing businesses in Southern Africa. Rosalind has held various roles in her career in South Africa, including Head of Group Real Estate Services at Liberty Holdings, as well as an account manager on International Donor-Funded Energy Efficiency Program, Senior Consultant for Power and Infrastructure Solutions, Technical Expertise for South African Bank's Carbon Trading Team and Carbon Project Development. Rosalind is a future energy leader of the World Energy Council and a director of the South African National Energy Association. There you are. I'm glad you're here. Thank you, Rosalind. Max, if you could. Thank you.
Awesome. Morning. Thanks, everyone. It's wonderful to be here and chat to you. We're actually not impacted as part of phase 1 of CBAM, but we're quite concerned about what might happen in phase 2, specifically when chemicals and polymers might come in, and also being in phase 2, then not having the benefit of any sort of transitionary period where we can start to understand how we should report and how we should get up to speed with the system when it's already up and running. Because of that, Chris asked me to chat to you a little bit about South African carbon tax, what we've been doing about that, what the changes would mean for a carbon taxpayer in South Africa, and a little bit about energy efficiency, renewable energy, and the work that we're doing to reduce our footprint year on year. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Impact. We're one of those big companies that people don't always know, but we're listed on the JSE. You can find all of our reports here. A bit about how we do use energy, what the boundary is for our carbon taxation in South Africa, what the impact of the changes from phase 2 will be on a taxpayer. And of course, we're only going to know for certain around about next week when we get our budget speech. And there might still be further opportunities to put comments in with tax law amendment bill. So important to take that into account. But this is just based on what we actually know right now. I'll talk about what our potential for decarbonisation actually is within South Africa and within our constraints. how we could decarbonize, and then what we can't decarbonize, how we can actually offset. And then I've got a little bit of a forward-looking what the future might be for us as impact and greenhouse gas emissions. Sure, there's a big delay. I understand what Henrik was saying. So yeah, this is Impact. We're the largest paper and plastic packaging business and the largest recyclers in South Africa. We have over 5,000 people working for us, and our 2023 revenue was 14 billion. I'm going to talk about our 2023 figures throughout this whole presentation. We are done with our 2024 year. It runs with the calendar year, but we're only presenting our results at the beginning of March, and then the reporting suite will only come out in April. So I'm working with what I have. One of the things we do that's quite interesting compared to other manufacturers is we actually design, build, and then use contract labor to construct. So that ground-based solar plant over there on the right of the slide, it's 5.4 megawatts at our Springs paper mill that we've actually built pretty much completely in-house, and then we do the ops and maintenance ourselves. So it's something that makes us a little bit unique from some of the other large manufacturers. We've got already 16 megawatts behind the meter. Our total grid connected demand is 50, and by 2027, we're going to go up to 25 megawatts, which sounds very good, but one must bear in mind that the sun only shines roughly a third of the day. Okay, so when we actually look at our energy use, in terms of gigajoules and energy value, we're mostly sitting in coal. But in terms of the actual cost, it's mostly electricity related. So previously, a lot of our energy efficiency projects have focused on electricity and electricity reduction, because that's where you can actually make the business case and get the things implemented. We have seen, however, that pricing, and this is pure pricing, not including any carbon levies, of all of the thermal fuels is going up way above inflation. And I've got the comparator with that purple line between the 2019 and the 2023 pricing. And with those increases, we're starting to see that there is more and more sort of direct incentive to reduce our thermal fuels, as well as the carbon taxation components. Okay. This is our boundary for carbon tax in South Africa. For people that don't know carbon very well, I often like to say your scope 1 is all of the emissions that would be caught if you put a giant glass bowl over your whole factory. So we pay all of our emissions and our carbon taxation on scope 1. It's basically coal, HFO, natural gas, and some liquid fuels. In theory, if you're running big systems, you might also have like SF6 in your transmission for anti-sparking with switching, and that would also be included if you're over the 50 kilogram sort of threshold that South Africa has. At the moment, Eskom's not paying on their scope 1 emissions, but that's something that's being discussed, and we'll find out when the announcements are made. Is that going to come through or not? And that's probably just going to come through as a direct pass-through cost to us. Interestingly, waste management and recycling are sitting outside of our tax net, which we'll talk about a little bit later, as well as scope 2 purchased electricity. At least it gives me time to breathe as I wait for it to change. So this is what our proposals for our tax-free allowances are looking like. The idea is they're going to start falling away quite steeply. I put in the quote from the Treasury workshop about strengthening the price signal. They've also said improving incentives, but one of the big problems with that is we're finding it hard to access available carbon offsets in the market because demand way exceeds supply. Because of this, the carbon offsets in our market are also trading at around 90% of the carbon price. So it depends really on what the absolute quantum of your carbon tax liability and what sort of your long-term agreements for purchasing emission reductions are as to how much money you actually save from your carbon tax liability. As well as the threshold starting to come down, we've also got an increase in both the marginal tax rate and then when the thresholds fall away, the effective tax rate as well. I'm mostly going to talk just about combustion emissions. I'm not going to get into the process and the fugitive emissions. That can be a little bit more complex and sort of process specific. I'm also not really going to talk about sequestration very much, although it is quite important for our sector and for forestry. And a lot of the paper companies in South Africa do get good sequestration benefits because we really are fixing carbon in our trees and in our lots. It changes there before it changes here. So this is the potential impact on the carbon taxpayer. We actually don't put out how much we're paying in carbon tax per year. So I've assumed that a 2023 carbon tax total liability was magically 100 million rand, exactly like that, no sense, nothing. In 2023, you could easily get 60% basic allowance, your tax-free allowance, 5% trade exposure allowance. We also have a component that looks at how we operate in terms of benchmark efficiency, and that we found from our energy efficiency efforts we're able to meet year on year. Trade exposure, if you're trade exposed, you also get a component that you do not have to pay. This is changing in the second phase as per what we've read so far. We'll see what the president and what the finance minister actually says, but the idea is it's going from 30% trade exposed to 50% trade exposed. So this could change quite a bit for taxpayers, depending on how much is happening in terms of export in the sector. Then we've got a 5% carbon budget allowance. We've had a voluntary carbon budget from the start. Everybody that has had a voluntary carbon budget does get this allowance. And then I've assumed 0% carbon offset allowance because there's such a shortage. So then you'd be 25 million in 2023. When the new phase comes in and the new plans, this would increase all the way up to 77.5 million because we lose the basic allowance, the trade exposure allowance. I've assumed that we'd keep the performance allowance, but it is very dependent on, are you implementing projects? Are you driving efficiencies? Are you reducing emissions? Over time, you see that the lines start to converge, but we are very far away from the 90 euros per tonne we heard this morning. At 22 rand a euro, it's roughly 2,000 rand. So even the 462, even the 462 is really only a quarter of what the price is going to be. Okay, so what do we do about it? Like Hendrik, with those projections, I just assumed our emissions stay exactly the same. Well, this mythical company's emissions stay exactly the same. No changes are made year on year, it's the same. Best ways to save, we've got to drive efficiency, we've got to drive renewables, and there's always great opportunities for fuel switching. Less opportunities, but maybe coming into the future, carbon capture, use and storage, and some other innovative options. So at Impact, we focus quite closely on reducing waste. Even though we've been reducing waste year on year on year, we've gotten 15% below our last baseline. We set a new baseline and we're going to go 15% below that. We're still finding spaces where we can actually reduce further. Start looking into your data, start going more granularly. You will find opportunities where you can get sort of these quick return projects. Hendrik also mentioned 1 to 3 years payback, energy efficiency as well. We've been driving energy efficiency continuously. It's some of the best return energy projects that you can get. We've also worked hard on renewable energy, and as well as our own self-build, we've got wheeled energy that's been wheeling to us for over 4 years now, and we've got some more that we're considering including, so that could hopefully take our liability even lower. And then beyond that, we'd have to look for different innovative projects, something that's really going to move the needle. But often these are the ones that come with high capital cost, long payback, uncertainty, technology risk. We don't have them in South Africa yet, so how should we bring them in and how should we run them? So these are really, really long timeline projects and require a lot of planning and a lot of research and a lot of support to get through board and decision making. So what could we actually do practically? Because the sun only shines a certain portion of the day, even if we get to our full grid connected demand, it's really only going to take a portion of our carbon emissions away. I'd say maybe 30% with both scope 1 and scope 2 often with our large facilities, eventually we run into a constraint where we actually don't have enough roof space or enough ground space to embed the generation that's equal to our demand. So with that in mind, then we can maybe wheel in a little bit more renewable energy, but there's only so much you can bring in with complementary profiles before you start having situations where maybe you have to pay for energy that you're not going to be able to use. And how do you manage that? Where exactly is the trade-off and the balance? And when will the way that we reconciling and passing wheeling credits on the South African grid change? Because that also brings in like a different degree of risk if we change from monthly financial reconciliations to shorter periods. So yeah, 50% from that, and then how do we actually go to net zero? Is it battery storage? Is it alternative ways to raise steam for our processes? Is it hydrogen? We're watching and we're not sure. One of the nice ways that we could decarbonize if there was availability would be switching from coal and HFO to gas. It's a wonderful fuel, very low emission factor, but we've just got availability challenges in South Africa. We've got one mill that actually doesn't have a substitution option because the paper machine runs so fast. So the only way we can dry the coating is gas. If pipeline gas falls away, then we need to probably go to a stored gas option, LPG tanks on site. Unfortunately, the smaller boilers where we're raising steam from gas, we just have to probably switch to coal or to HFO, which would have a higher emission impact, but at least it would give us the fuel security and the ability to run those businesses into the future. There's also the risk of the longer that we use fossil fuels, the longer that we raise steam and run thermal fuels, the more there is a business risk, a reputational risk because of the social and economic impact of climate change. So we're keen to switch, we're just struggling to find viable alternatives. Okay, on that we did look at renewable biomass, and it would be wonderful if we could swing to renewable biomass across the board, but we are a very water scarce country, so there isn't a lot of biomass that is available to us. That said, we've recently found a partner that's got a good sustainable source of waste biomass that we think we can trust to go forward into the future. It's not something like working for water that's taking out alien invasive species. So if they're really successful, then you've got no biomass left. So we can't make that sort of decision. This also would just be for our smaller boilers. So it could maybe cover 10% of our entire boiler fleet. But it would be quite nice in terms of like taking it forward and cutting emission reductions. Okay, we've also spoken about combined heat and power, very widely used in Europe, not so often used in South Africa because we don't have district heating requirements, but we are able to use combined heat and power at Mkondo, where we do run a back pressure turbine, and then we take the exhaust of the back pressure turbine to the paper machine where there is steam demand, and use the electricity on site. It's a small portion of our total grid demand, but it does help a lot. And in the same vein, looking at waste to energy, the plastics that we have that are so contaminated that we can't recycle them anymore, as well as the short fibers that can't go into a new sheet of paper anymore because they don't have the strength to make a strong sheet. We're looking at whether we can take these and burn with EU emission standards, with tops and bottoms ash, with baghouse, with cement that can go into bricks to make both electricity and steam. And we'd also be an off-taker for both of these. It would be embedded behind our meter. Okay, an unconventional one that we're looking at is do you store energy, or do you take energy and go to thermal energy and store thermal energy? We've been doing some sums about could we store energy in large steel blocks and then use this energy to then raise steam. At the moment, very expensive. It doesn't scale very well, and it needs a large portion of renewable energy. But it could start becoming something that's workable when we start seeing sort of more frequent reconciliation of renewable energy on our grid, and maybe we've got excess megawatts that are available at midday when our solar is running and the grid is also running at a really, really sort of good price and renewable, very renewable. Apologies. Cool. So should we do this, or should we rather just wait for battery pricing to fall? Should we rather store electricity? And furthermore, will we ever be using hydrogen in industrial heat, or is it only going to be a fuel that's really used in the transportation sector? We've got some projects at the moment looking at whether we could get hydrogen into some of our forklifts, which is quite nice. Weird constraint about that is you need to pressurize to anywhere between 45 and 350 bar. 350 bar is Toyota Mirai operating pressure. The lowest tech we've seen is 135, but I recently saw a demonstration that works at 45 bar. So there's a huge energy penalty to get to a usable pressure for hydrogen, which is one of the hurdles if you don't have hydrogen pipelines on site to decarbonize. Okay, and then last of all, once you've done everything that you think you can possibly do and economically do on site with energy efficiency and renewable energy, we can then go to offsetting. Because the market's so short for us and we haven't been able to get carbon offsets, we've been working on making our own. We've gone through at least the visit for validation, and we're responding to our first round of comments probably next week or the week thereafter. We're looking at generating our own offsets from our behind-the-meter solar. It's only allowed on voluntary carbon standard because it is small scale and mostly grid connected and for self-consumption. So we're hopeful that this could be a good avenue to reduce our further carbon tax liability. We've also looked into whether we could do this for waste and recycling, because waste is out of our tax net and will stay out of our tax net forever. What we found is the moment we start approaching our suppliers and say, you know, we're thinking of doing this carbon thing, can we like claim the rights to the carbons that we can actually try and register? The guys are saying, oh no, like if there's something there, I want part of it. But when we look at the economics of the project, because all of the auditors are international, every time you have a validation or verification, it's about R1 million. At carbon pricing last year, it just didn't warrant going into it to generate these offsets. Okay, so what's the future? We're going to continue to look at new technology to test. We try to test in a modular approach so that we understand what's going on and then we can implement. How to fund these trials, partnerships with technology providers, developers, funders, regulatory incentives. We've used the 12L energy efficiency tax incentive quite extensively from DTI. CBAM, beyond the current 7, I think I counted iron and steel separately, so that's how I got 7. Carbon price adjustments, it can really change the economics of all of our projects, so we'll see what happens and what is the law and what is the requirement going forward. Battery storage, I think it could be a game changer for this whole decarbonization journey. Waste to energy, huge impact for us, but very, very high priced, comes with a lot of risk. It will be the first time we run technology like this in South Africa. And then carbon capture and storage. I actually have my master's in carbon capture and storage. I thought it would never, never, never happen, but maybe there'll be a change. Maybe we'll start using fossil fuels and actually capturing either direct air or from the stack. And that is me.
Okay, Rosalind's on her way, but I think let's get started with a first round of questions. Just a reminder for those who are attending virtually to please put up your hand and type your question in to the chat, and then it will be fed through as time allows or answered afterwards by email. So everything will be answered. From the floor, is there a first round of questions for the panelists?
Yeah, hi there, thanks. I'm Cornelia Kiwi from RMB. I think the question was maybe to Hendrik. You made a comment around the buying of renewable energy certificates and how that needs to be bundled with a PPA to get benefit. So maybe just a bit more clarity on that.
Okay, yes, I think I'll explain to you my understanding of it currently, but maybe Vincente would like to then expand on that. So the current CBAM ruling, as we understand it, is that when you buy energy through a PPA, you know who built the facility and you know that they are supplying you with energy through that PPA contract, and there's no uncertainty about that. And any renewable energy certificates generated as a result of that are then valid renewable energy certificates. But if you buy from an existing facility older than 15 years and they generate renewable energy certificates, etc., they are typically not allowed currently. And if the Eskom grid suddenly decides to sell off the certificates associated with nuclear, for instance, that would be highly doubted that it would be valid. And that's what that comment is from my understanding. I don't know if Vincente, would you like to expand on that?
Maybe on emissions, on indirect emissions, where I can see that there is a lot of interest on how it will work. I mean, in general, the main rule for reporting emissions under the CBAM for all goods, it's the actual emissions. So you know, and I mentioned scope 1, we are not considering scope 3. We don't think we will include scope 3. With the exception of some precursors. I mean, you mentioned bauxite. I don't think bauxite will be included. Mining is not the idea to be included, but there might be some ferrous alloys that, for example, now are included, and that might be an extension to some other. So some of the precursors which are considered scope 3 are in. We were discussing about scrap during the break. I mean, that could also be under consideration, but not the rest of the scope 3. Let's be clear, not the transport, not the packaging in general. Then when it comes to scope 2, only cement and fertilizers. And for the rest of the sectors, we are still under analysis. You ask in your questions or your uncertainties, by when? I mean, there will be this report by the end of the year where the Commission will be analyzing the possibility of the extension, the pros, the cons, the advantages, and possibly making a suggestion. But then, of course, there will have to be some debate in the EU, and of course, it will be open also to debate with countries, whether on the pertinence of extending or not. And then, if there is a decision, that would be possibly in a proposal in the first half of next year, which doesn't mean that it has to apply from 27. I mean, that also will have to be decided. The same for the extension of sectors. I mean, you mentioned pulp, chemicals, or polymers. Let's be clear, they were not included at the beginning, despite being highly traded, highly intensive in carbon emissions, because they are difficult. I mean, there are so many production routes, so many goods. And one of the problems we have with CBAM is that we need to assign the emissions at the level of the goods, as Hendrik was explaining. So we don't do it at the level of the installation. Of course, the departure point is the installation, but then you need to really drill down to the level of the goods. So on indirect emissions, for the cement and the fertilizers, now we need to decide in an implementing regulation, which will come this year, what is the system, how to assign the emissions for those, I mean, how to determine the level of the emissions which correspond to indirect emissions from the electricity. There are different possibilities. One that maybe could be the most promising one is using the average carbon intensity of the grid. Okay, and this is something that we are considering. Of course, that has advantages and disadvantages, but there will always be the possibility to go for the actual emissions, and then you need to comply with some requirements. And then this is the question of having, for example, PPA or a direct link between the producer of the electricity and the smelter, for example. If you have a windmill or solar panels, or you talk about CHP or whatever, I mean, if you have different ways to justify a different level of emissions, which will be much lower than the average of the grid in South Africa, that, as you showed in your graph, is one of the highest, then in that case, you can also claim that your indirect emissions will be much lower. Then the question of the RECs or GOs or other type of certification, That's something that for the moment we are not considering. I mean, when I say we are not considering, means that in the CBAM regulation they are not accepted, because we have concerns about the greenwashing with those certificates and how much they can be trusted. But that's something, of course, which is under discussion. I mean, I'm not saying that the discussion is over, but I don't want to mislead anyone, and I don't want to promise that we are going to accept them. I think that it's more to the contrary. But of course, we are open to analyze them. We are open, of course, to discuss about how trustful they are, and I mean, how they work, because of course, they work in different ways. I know that in Africa in general, there is a big interest in the RECs, and that they are used a lot for other purposes. But that's something that we want to analyze a bit better. We want to have a better understanding of all that. I mentioned that it would be the average of the grid, but another consideration, and this is how we do, for example, for the importation of electricity. You are not interested in that because you are not exporting electricity to the EU, but for the electricity imported into the EU, the rule is the carbon intensity of the marginal source, which is the most polluting source. I mean, maybe in South Africa, would not be so relevant because you basically produce with coal, but I can tell you that in some countries, for example, in the Maghreb, the average intensity is much lower, for example, than the intensity of the electricity produced from coal or from natural gas. So this is a debate, a discussion that we are having. These countries, for example, they are very much interested, and then we move to an average rather than the CO2 emission factor, because that one is very high and doesn't take into account the efforts to decarbonize their electricity. Sorry if I was a bit too long, but I took the opportunity also to address other issues. Sorry, if we don't accept RECs?
So if you don't accept RECs, does that also extend to other carbon offsets?
Yeah, well, that's a question with respect to carbon pricing. And then for carbon pricing, what we are accepting now, we have a definition in our regulation, which accepts systems or carbon prices paid either in the form of a tax or a levy on CO2 emissions, of course. It cannot be just a fuel tax, which doesn't have any CO2 component. And we also accept, of course, other ETS. We don't include offsets or voluntary markets. We are really targeting compliance markets because you know about all these questions about how trustful they are, how transparent, integrity, etc. But we are following also the discussions on Article 6.2, 6.4 within the Paris Agreement. As you know, in COP29, there was some sort of breakthrough with respect to also Article 6.4, and with this, the regulatory board. So that's something that we are analyzing. We had the conversation yesterday with the National Treasury, and I think I can share with you, and we are analyzing some carbon pricing systems. We have launched a study with a consultant, by the way. One of the case studies is the South African carbon price, because we really want to understand better. And what we are looking at with positive eyes is the possibility of some offsets, if there is, of course, some reassurance within compliance markets and with some limits. So that's something that we could be considering positively. Please, everything I'm saying is just reflections. I'm being transparent with you. I'm not saying that we are going to do this or that, but that's something that we are reflecting. Another example is the Australian safeguard mechanism. I mean, if you know a bit the system in Australia, they also allow with a limit to have some sort of national offsets. Of course, international offsets becomes a bit more difficult, but if you have some sort of limited options for national offsets, that's something that we could look at positively. But we need to get reassurances. And by the way, with respect to the carbon pricing, sorry for taking a bit long, as part of the simplifications, we are considering maybe the possibility also of coming with default values for carbon pricing. We will have at the end of the year, we will publish at the end of the year the benchmarks for the free allocation, so that you also have certainty about what is the benchmark for your good from 2026. I think that's something which is important because, as I said before, you only pay, or there will only be an adjustment on the excess above the benchmark. And but there will be also always the possibility also of using default values for the emissions. If you are unable to monitor your emissions, I don't think this is the case in South Africa, but many countries complain that We don't have MRV systems. We don't have a carbon pricing system. We never did that. We need more time in order to be able to monitor our emissions. Okay, there will be the possibility of using default values, and these default values will be also published by the end of this year, and they will be good per good and country per country. Now we have a list, if you are interested, that comes from the JRC report, where you extracted the graph, and there you can, we are using now a worldwide average of the carbon intensity per CN code, but not per country. But we really want to go more deep into, or dive into really the carbon intensity of country per country. Now we are considering something similar for the carbon price, and I think that could be a good simplification, because if we can agree on saying, okay, your average carbon price, effective carbon price for this good is this, I think that's something that can help a lot. And this could, of course, take into account in one way or another the offsets.
I am Philippa Rodseth, Manufacturing Circle. Both Hulamin and Impact are member companies. I have a question regarding current thoughts on funds received in the EU related to CBAM and where they could be deployed. Our understanding at the moment is that those would possibly go into the general budget. Is there any thinking around the possible ring fencing of those funds to then be deployed into decarbonisation projects, for example?
Thank you. This is a discussion which is taking place as we speak. The agreement that was taken between the three, or among the three institutions in the EU, Council, Parliament, and the Commission, long ago, like 3 years ago, was to say we are going to make a new own resource based on the revenues from the ETS, or part of the revenues of the ETS, and also the revenues from CBAM. The idea was we will accrue all those revenues to the EU budget, and from there, with no earmarking, no specific earmarking. Of course, as you know, the European Union is contributing a lot to development in third countries, but also to decarbonization in third countries. I have colleagues here who can elaborate on all the different programs that we have with South Africa, like the JETP, but other type of partnerships, also programs for green hydrogen in order to decarbonize. So, but the discussion is still going on. It has not been closed. Because there is no agreement in the Council about making this new own resource. I know that there will be another discussion at the end of this month, but the idea is, of course, to do that. If there is no agreement, that means the revenues will go to the member states, because the member states are the ones who are selling the CBAM certificates. So one of the issues that we could consider, but that's, I'm going too far because we are not going so far yet, is whether there could be some sort of obligations of member states to recycle those revenues. But the question of earmarking of carbon pricing is something which is important, and I think it's very, it came in all the meetings we had yesterday. I think we share, my colleagues in DG Klima, they share the experience with the EU ETS, where we have been collecting something like 200 billion since 2005, and which has been recycled into the decarbonization projects of the EU industry. So that's something which is important. So our message was to say, use revenues. The idea is to say, it's not bad introducing carbon pricing. It's a good idea because it will have a big and important effect on decarbonization. And this is our experience. We can share the experience with you, and this is what has shown that when we have introduced carbon pricing, and in particular in the sectors where there were less or no free allowances, like for example in the power generation sector, we have seen that the decarbonization has been much, much faster. But it has to be accompanied by good communication. We are not doing this just to collect your revenues. We are collecting revenues because we also want to foster and to reinvest in projects which will decarbonize. And this is important. The problem, because I come from taxation area, the problem with taxes is that normally they are accrued to the budget, to the national budget, and there are always difficulties in earmarking those revenues. But that's a conversation that you need to have, and that's something that I think in one way or another has to be. If I want to be nice with the industry, I will say to my colleagues in the ministries, yeah, use revenues. I think it's a good idea increase in the carbon pricing, and it's a very much better idea to recycle those revenues to support the green transition. But the discussion on CBAM will continue.
May I take my prerogative as moderator just to tack on a question there, which is around how the EU would view the use of recycled the recycled taxes within South Africa to subsidize industries to assist in their decarbonisation. Would that be, would the effective tax rate then still be deductible from the CBAM?
No, I mean, the straightforward answer is no. I mean, we also do the same in the EU. I mean, I mentioned that we recycle those revenues in order to invest in projects for decarbonization. So for us, this is not reducing the carbon price. Reducing the carbon price would be some sort of course, if you apply allowances, you cannot say that if the nominal carbon price is the real carbon price or the effective carbon price, or whether, for example, the money is given back through some sort of rebates or reimbursement, I don't know, for whatever reasons. That would not be acceptable. But of course, if you use your revenues in order to support your green transition, and in order, for example, by creating, I mean, we have an innovation fund, we have a modernization fund, that's something that we welcome.
Thank you. Question over here.
Good morning, all. My name is Dompumelelo Mugo. I'm from Business Leadership South Africa. So I've got two questions, mainly for Hendrik and Rosalind. So the first question, and we're sitting here cracking our heads trying to really look at not just today, but probably the next couple of years. How will your businesses survive with the ongoing increase of with the ongoing reduction of allowances and so on and so forth in the SA carbon tax? And what should we be doing as businesses to advocate, perhaps maybe for extension and so on and so forth? Because what you painted, I think both sides. I mean, one side, Hendrik, you painted the picture of the energy, or scope 2, as you call it. The price is very high of electricity because of the coal side, right? And it's not going to change anytime soon. We all know that. On your side, Rosalind, you painted the picture of in the next 2 years, there will be a very high increase given that some allowances will actually fall off. So shouldn't we be rather proposing, for the short term, an extension of sorts? Because as we see and as we look at where our country is, we're not going to be able to cope if we continue in the same trajectory. And then my second question is directly to you, Rosalind, around the CBAM. One of the points you mentioned in your last slide was around, the CBAM could be a type of relief. I just wanted to get just a little bit more color around what do you actually mean there? What could be done from a CBAM perspective? And I think we should be doing something locally ourselves for the carbon tax, just to be able to balance things off, look at the longer term around economic growth.
Okay. So we're very concerned, and we don't think that we'll be able to pass through the increases all the way to the end consumer. And is there the possibility of absorbing within the business when something triples, and it's not a small cost over a period of 3 years? So we've put in comments very similar, I think, to the businesses in the EU. We also don't like that the tax-free thresholds are falling away, and the speed at which they're falling away is quite concerning. It doesn't really give us much time to start budgeting and planning. And that said, we've been quite active in terms of energy efficiency and renewable energy. We did a quantification, and we think since 2019 we've saved R1 billion worth of costs. and that's huge for us in energy. But we're just working on the actual energy prices, not looking at the moment at the additional levies on top of those. So we've put in comments. We put in comments through our industry association, PAMSA. It's been very, very quiet. We were saying yesterday when we sat as the environmental committee, does anybody even have a word on the street, like what's happening? But it's been very, very quiet. So we're going to have to wait and see what comes out in the budget speech. And then there is also that opportunity through the tax law amendment bill process, the TLAB process, where I think we'll see the feedback and then we'll look at how we can respond and then put comments in again. I'm not certain I 100% understand your second question, so you must tell me if I'm getting it a little bit wrong. There is in the CBAM an opportunity to offset what we are paying in the local tax. And when we sat down as the board and the senior management team to work out whether we were CBAM exposed or not, interestingly, one of the comments was, I'd rather give this money to South Africa than to the EU, because then in theory it could be used internally, it could be recycled. I mentioned that we've used 12L. That's one of the few ways that our carbon tax revenue is actually recycling back into business and back into the economy. But I mean, that said, the differential is so huge, like roughly 2,000 Rand a ton versus the 400 and something, and that's the actual tax rate, not the effective tax rate after the tax-free threshold. It's concerning. We don't have plans as yet exactly how we're going to deal with it once we know exactly how it's going to come in and what the final decision is. Did that help? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I've forgotten the question by now, but I think I'll start with how do we actually deal with this? What are our plans? So in our case, the Scope 2 emissions coming from electricity is the big thing in our lives, and we've been actively planning for this from about 22 onwards. So the way that Hulamin can address this, the resource efficiency projects and so on, they save you money, but they are not going to shift the needle dramatically. So we simply have to buy renewable energy. That's the only way we can see. So we are actively pursuing that. We have been since 22. We are at a point where we've gone through a whole procurement process. We are just about ready to sign a power purchase agreement that could give something like 45% of our electricity to us from solar. So that will be a 45% reduction in CBAM applicable levies right there. From there on, it gets more difficult because, as Rosalind mentioned, the sun only shines so often, so wind, and hopefully in our future, nuclear and battery storage. And we're also in a region in the country where there's biomass available, so biomass-generated electricity. Those are all future phases that we will then consider. The problem is, however, that Hulamin is, in terms of energy consumption, we're a large consumer, certainly 30 megawatts on average. But when you compare that to over a gigawatt, 1,200 megawatts, I think, of the smelter upstream of us, it's not so easy to decarbonize them. Now you're talking about countrywide kind of initiatives, and that's where 90% of our embedded emissions lie. So that is where the real challenge is, and that's why I said it's a national issue and it needs to be a grid issue. So I think I've addressed the issue of what can we actually do and what's within our capabilities. I'm not sure if there was something else that I needed to address.
Thank you. If I can link that back to the first question on the eligibility of environmental attribute certificates, one of our biggest challenges in this country is to move away from coal for our power generation. And the only thing that's going to do that is the development of renewables or nuclear to decarbonize the grid. And at the moment, some of the really structural challenges that we have in terms of how moving from a centralized supply of electricity and the structural change to a market which would facilitate a lot of investment in renewable energy because of the economic case for that is something that I would certainly encourage you to delve into the details of that, because that's going to help us practically to decarbonize, and that's linked very closely to how embedded Scope 2 emissions are actually what is allowable and what is not allowable. So yeah. Can we take one final question? You want to respond? Yes.
Just to say, as I mentioned before, we are in contact with ESCOM. They are explaining their plans, how they are doing this. They know very well, I mean, the requirements I mentioned before in order to move from a default value based on the average of the carbon intensity for the electricity for indirect emissions to something which could be the actual emissions. And one of the issues, for example, is the structure that you mentioned, and that the PPAs, for example, are signed by the producer. They are not signed directly by the producer of the electricity with the final consumer, with the smelter, but by one of the intermediaries or one of the transmission or the DSOs, etc. I mean, that's something that we are looking at, and we will come with many implementing regulations. I mentioned about verification, carbon pricing. There will be one on indirect emissions in particular, and this is one of the things that I think we can fix. I mean, we are working on that, and that's thanks to ESCOM and South Africa, because they brought to our attention how these markets are working, and I think that there are possibilities to adapt and in order to take into account also those specific varieties. We cannot accommodate everything, I'm afraid, because we are not only regulating for the EU or for South Africa, we are regulating for the whole of the world, but there are issues that can be, of course, looked at and that we can find some sort of solutions.
Thank you. Is the last question?
Thank you. Fanele Mondi from Energy Intensive Users Group of Southern Africa. Vincent, you touched on two things probably related. One, the latest one, that you are in contact with ESCOM, certainly with regards to the impact they have on Scope 2. But earlier on, you commented on the uncertainty around the use of RECs. And I'm sure you have engaged with ESCOM on what they are considering regarding the nuclear attributes and renewable energy attributes. What are the prospects of that? When you are commenting around RECs, you are saying that it's still uncertain, and yet ESCOM is moving ahead in preparation for nuclear attributes. What is the CBAM stance on that, or at least prospects of that materializing as a recognized solution or mitigation?
Yeah, I mentioned two things. One, uncertainty. Well, there is a certainty. We don't accept them. That's the certainty now. The question is, okay, we are learning during this transitional period. We are understanding how these things work. The point you raised was raised by ESCOM, indeed. I mean, that's something that we are analyzing. But as I said before as well, I mean, we have real serious doubts about how to use those RECs. I mean, how to accept those RECs in order to be able to identify the origin of the electricity. But for the moment, we are open to listen. We are trying to understand better how it works, and we are trying to see whether there is sufficient margin of maneuver to trust how these certificates work. But I can tell you that so far we are not there yet. I mean, we are not accepting them. But the discussion is still going on. I mean, if I can only encourage you to contact us in bilateral to share with us more information about how these RECs work, in particular for nuclear, as you were saying, and I mean how you have all the reassurance that there are no possibilities for greenwashing with this type of certificate.
Thank you. So with that, I'd like to close and just firstly to remind everyone about the recording of the seminar. An edited recording is going to be made available. For all the online participants, your questions that we were not able to get to due to time will be answered, and you will be notified via email when the recording is available. Please, for any further questions or queries or clarification on issues, you're very welcome to direct these to the EU Chamber of Commerce and Industry at info@euchamber.coza. And their website at www.euchamber.coza.za. So what remains now for me is to thank the panelists very much for their presentations, which were really informative. To thank the EU for their support and the EU Chamber for hosting and organizing. And then to everybody in the room and everyone online for participating and learning more in this event today. So thank you, everybody.